Welcome to the final panel of a very exciting week. We've been exploring how the UN family is applying the quintet of change to deliver impact, build coalitions, and accelerate progress on the SDGs. My name is Liliana Orudo. I work in the Secretariat's Business Transformation Division, evangelizing new ways of working and infusing our work with creativity. I'm one of the stewards of New Work, a grassroots community of culture catalysts, co-creating new ways of working and fostering an agile, inclusive, and empowering culture across the UN. I hope you've been inspired and empowered this week, and that you'll join our UN 2.0 communities to continue the dialogue and to co-create the future UN. Before we dive in, we'd like to hear from you in a word or two. Share an intention you hold for today's conversation. You can scan the QR code. Oh, can we pull up this Slido? Or you can connect on slido.com and enter. I see people are joining from over. Visit slido.com and you enter the code 3105909. From Guyana, welcome. I see from Philly, people are joining from all over. I'm going to repost. Can we get the Slido up on the screen? I think, so it's wonderful. Oh, there we go. So now you can see the QR code. If you want to scan the QR code and also join us, slido.com. And it's so amazing to see how many people have joined this week. We'll have some information on that later, some more details. Joining us here on Zoom, on LinkedIn Live, joining from all over the world. And I know it's Friday, it's late for some of you. It's almost the weekend, essentially. We're really thankful for the support of everyone who's joined us this week, taking the time to join us in this UN 2.0 week. Today is Culture Day. We'll be focusing on cultural transformation, organizational transformation, systems change across the UN family, and a number of initiatives. But first, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Shauna Carey. She's a designer, strategist, and social impact leader. Shauna, what's your intention for today?
Thank you so much for having me, Liliana. I would say my intention for today is to connect some dots across geographies, hopefully, and also across different initiatives going on in the UN family. So with that, I think we'll just dive right in. Sounds good? So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today on Culture Day. I'm a bit of a culture nerd, so this is special for me. Um, for many of us, it feels like the world may be changing faster than ever right now. And that's the context that this conversation is happening within. Between the climate crisis, the latest technological revolution, geopolitical shifts, and so many other factors, there are forces reshaping our work, our daily life, and the UN every day. And as I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in this session. And meeting the challenges of this moment requires a collective mindset shift for all of us. And at its heart, I know that's what UN 2.0 is all about. It's about becoming an organization that can navigate that complexity and uncertainty with confidence. Uh, and we want a culture that is agile, responding quickly to emerging challenges, that is inclusive, where diverse perspectives belong and drive better solutions, that is innovative, where ideas can come from anywhere or anyone, and that is learning focused, where mistakes feel like stepping stones that we're collectively walking towards a better way. And so, why are we talking about culture today? For me, it's really because culture is the foundation that everything else is built on. Without the right culture, the best plans and strategies in the world won't deliver the change we need, because culture drives behavior and culture is with us in all of the moments that we're doing our work. And today we have a set of leaders on our panel who embody the spirit of UN 2.0 and hopefully will be generous in sharing their lessons about culture with all of us, modeling the very culture we're trying to create. So here with me today are Dr. Felipe Pollier, who is the Assistant Secretary General of the UN Youth Office. Felipe, can you come off mute and tell us what your intention for today is?
Hey, of course. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, buenos días, buenas tardes, y buenas noches for everyone in the call. So I'm really here to share a little bit about my journey in the UN and how I believe what we are doing, what I'm doing in my role every day as Assistant Secretary General for Youth has to do with this cultural shift and how connected it is with UN 2.0. But I'm here also to learn about how others are bringing this, vision in practice in their daily roles from different sides of the organization.
Thank you, Felipe. We also have with us today Ayaka Suzuki, who is the Director of Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit at the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Ayaka, in one or two words, can you tell us what your intention is today?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So happy to be here. So my intention today is tap into the energy of this group. Like you just said, Shauna, these are really scary and uncertain times, but there's so much that we can do ourselves to make the UN a better organization that is fit for purpose. So that's why I'm here.
Great. Thank you so much. We also have with us today Ozonia Ogiello, who's the UN Resident Coordinator in Rwanda. Ozonia, do you want to come off mute and share your intention in a couple words with us?
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Kigali, Rwanda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For me today is to demonstrate that we are all agents of cultural change and transformation. It doesn't require anyone to be in high-level positions, to be in New York, or to be regional director or assistant secretary general. Each of us brings something to the table, and I'd like to share some context-specific experiences of how this has been done so that it can inspire others to become the agents of change we want in the UN system.
Thank you for that. Next, we have Milena Strasser. Milena is the co-founder and head of coaching of Idea Mix Coaching and brings over 20 years of experience around the world in strategy, talent development, and organizational growth. Very relevant for today's conversation. Milena, what's your intention today?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be part of this amazing team talking about culture. My intention today is to bring the perspective of the private sector around culture and, of course, discuss some of the initiatives that we are doing within this sector.
Thank you for that. And finally, we have with us today Professor Raul Sanchez, who is the director of the NYU Intersectionality Lab, also an award-winning professor on intercultural communication, a critical underpinning of the culture work we're going to talk about today, at the NYU School of Professional Studies. And Professor Sanchez has been working with the UN on a variety of different learning initiatives. So Raul, do you want to share your intention with us, and then I'll take us into the conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Shauna, and thank you, Liliana, and everyone for being here. So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So, my intention is to spark collaborative innovation. I think this ecosystem of partnerships where we have higher education, the workforce, we're thinking intergenerationally is very important to catalyze the future. So, so that's my intention today, is to spark collaborative innovation with all of you and with those listening, and hopefully in our network of interconnecting systems around the world. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for preemptively for sharing your perspectives with us today. And I want to pick up on something you said, Felipe, which is that my hope as well is that this session can feel like a learning lab for everyone, panelists and participants, one where we can have honest, curious, and practical reflection that can act as some of the seeds for the culture change that we're seeking. So in that spirit, let's get into it, shall we? All right. And we also, just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone joining us today. Feel free to go ahead and post questions throughout the session as you have them. And then we're going to have about 10 minutes for Q&A. You can vote on other people's questions. You can add your own. And I will do my best to steer us through a Q&A that gets as many of those answered as possible by our panelists. So please do that throughout. All right, so I'm ready to dig in. I hope everyone else is too. I want to start with talking a little bit about what UN 2.0 means in practical terms. So I'm going to ask a couple of you, starting with you, Ayaka, maybe to share a specific example from your part of the organization where culture change made a real and practical difference in the work that's getting done. Like ground this for us in the reality. What did you do? How to help your organization achieve better results?
Great, thank you. So at its core, UN 2.0 is about reshaping the UNs to be ready for today's rapidly changing world, where challenges are moving faster, like we already just mentioned, but there are also lots of opportunities. And it's about equipping ourselves with essential new skills, AI, data, digital tools, innovation, foresight, and behavioral science. That's all. I mean, we've been talking about that all week by now, but it's not technical, right? I just want to emphasize that it's not a technical thing. The new its skills alone are not enough. It's about our mindset, and ultimately, we have to shift our culture. UN may be 80, but we have to stay young at heart and be nimble and agile. And a practical example on culture change comes from our experience with these UN communities of practice. We have 5 communities of practice, well, 5 or 6, depending on how you count. And math has never been my strength, frankly. They are really at the core of UN 2.0 transformation. And so rather than creating yet another structure from scratch, we embrace and amplify decentralized and informal exchange groups. You're all members of that. And that includes UN Innovation Network, the Data Strategy Community, the New Work Community, and others as part of the growing UN 2.0 community of moving ahead with this transformation agenda. These peer-to-peer networks are so powerful, and they are dedicated spaces for knowledge exchanges and experimentation, connecting over 15,000 colleagues around the globe. They are creating safe spaces to explore new things, fail safely sometimes, but most importantly, learn together. And I think all of you who are members of these communities can attest to that. And the result? More collaborative teams, faster solutions, and tangible results, such as improved crisis response through predictive analytics, and so many things that you could actually, we have highlighted some of them in our portfolios. And that's what UN 2.0 looks like in action. So UN is kind of, the stereotype is that we're so bureaucratic, nothing ever changes. But all of you guys, as part of these communities, are really changing. That's not the case, right? And this is really transformation happening from bottom up.
Thank you. That's a great sort of grounding for us. I wonder, Ozonia, maybe you can share with us an example from what you're seeing in Rwanda?
Thank you, Shauna. Building on what Ayaka has said, the key point then is how do you ground truth it in a country context? And for Rwanda, it meant how do you reconnect the UN to its real purpose, which is to serve the interests of Rwanda. It's not about the UN, but it's about how the UN supports Rwanda to achieve its own socio-economic transformation. And the main vehicle for doing that is the the cooperation framework, which is the 5-year plan that the UN develops together with the host government. So how do you ensure that that plan is not the lowest common denominator of all the agencies bring to the table, but it's a translation of a common vision anchored on the socio-economic transformation of the country through a strategic and collective offer from the UN to the government of the people. And this offer arises from an integral and systemic approach to change and transformation. And how did we do that? We invested in ourselves as leaders, not just as the heads of agencies, but also our deputies and our senior programming staff over a 2-year period in leadership, adaptive leadership, transformation systems, and integral thinking. And we embarked on some prototype projects to see how we can do this happen. And so in these 2 years, we then came to a process where we're able to create a common vision of what it is we can offer. There are many development problems in every country. The UN must not be there for everything. There are other partners. So when you look at the canvas of problems and you look at what others are doing and you ask yourself, what is our comparative advantage as a UN system? And you locate yourself in that comparative advantage, then you define a system for working and implementation that is not focused on sectors or thematic areas that agencies work on, but elevates the UN offer at a strategic and upstream level. And so what we then managed to achieve in Rwanda was our former cooperation framework had 6 outcomes.
I think we might have lost.
We lost Azonia for a moment. I'm just giving a couple seconds.
Or in the outputs, but an integral approach by the UN system. And I'm happy to speak a little bit more about this if colleagues want me to.
Great. Thank you, Azonia. I appreciate in particular your point that although culture is in some ways an internal transformation, it's about the change you want to create outside of our organizations, and that's an important distinction. Felipe, I wonder if you can share a little bit about from the perspective of the youth office.
For sure, Shauna. And allow me before to thank all the team behind this week and this call, and on the people, on people as Ayaka, Liliana, Talia, but it's many more working, and everyone in the communities that is making this UN 2.0 possible, And when I connect with your question and my role in the organization and the role of our team and our office in the UN, for us, UN 2.0 is not a theory, because it's really something that it's embodied in the mandate of our office in the system, because the role of our office in a very interconnected and very complex ecosystem that the UN represents, because the UN, it's about, of course, everyone that works in the UN and is supporting the UN in delivering its mandate in the ground, especially because, as Sonia was mentioning, that's the purpose. The UN is for people. Our UN Charter starts speaking about we, the people of the United Nations. But the UN, it's also about its governments because it's an intergovernmental organization. And the UN, of course, it's also about all those stakeholders that also are necessary to be brought into the table when it's about shaping the future of global issues, civil society organizations, the private sector, and of course, young people, So the role of our office in this complex system is really about this cultural shift in how, we understand that in this ecosystem, we need to work with young people as partners and not as beneficiaries, And it's a cultural transformation, Since I joined the UN, I've been 1 year and a half now. For several months, one of the, concepts I had on my whiteboard, I have a whiteboard in my office. I'm not sure you can see it there, but it's over there. It said cultural shift, And Osona was reflecting about this, and also Ayaka, For the UN, it's really impossible to be fit to purpose, prepare for the future if we don't, bring all these new skill sets and all this transformation that we need, that in its base, in its solid foundation needs to have this cultural shift, in how we do things, And for us, for the UN, it's impossible to be fit to purpose without the agency and the skills of young people, UN 2.0, it's really about bringing young people closer, and not really only about young people to speak, but it's really young people to lead, with an intergenerational perspective, It's not about young people against older generations, It's really about the intergenerational solidarity that this represents, In practice, how we can do this, and I will share a little bit of what we are doing in the UN Youth Office, because we have this mandate in this role in the system about convening parts and moving together onto this cultural transformation. But it's also about how we walk the talk and how we concretely do it in our daily issues, So for us, it's about shifting more decision-making authority into the hands of young people, And we started by having young people in our workforce, and we have one of the youngest workforce in the United Nations system in terms of average of the age of our staff, We also have a youth advisory body, We have a youth reference group that it's a body that supports us, and we consult and advise us in our strategic priorities and initiatives, because the reality, you know, is if we want to have this forward thinking culture, it's about including young people, you know, and it's about, I think, very simple changes, you know. And I was a few weeks ago in Kazakhstan, and I was interviewed by the youngest UN volunteer in Kazakhstan, and she was asking me, you know, about this culture shift, and I was reflecting with her, you know. I think it's really about these simple questions, you know, and it's sometimes about questioning, you know, why we're doing this, you know. It's about sometimes asking questions, you know, and it's about ending, you know, this idea of we've done this way because we've always done this in this way, you know. And I think that small things are the cultural shifts we're talking about.
I really appreciate that. And I want to pick up on, I'm going to move us along only because we're light on time. But I want to pick up on your thread on leadership because, you know, while we know that this culture shift is a collective mandate, we also can observe that there are individuals and leaders who possess a natural gift for influencing culture in any one of our organizations. So, Raul, I'm going to start with you, and then maybe Ayak, I'll ask you to ground it in the context of the UN. But can you share an example of how to identify and support culture catalysts in organizations and practical advice that leaders can take on to find and support those people?
Great. Thank
Sure,
you.
sure.
And
Oh,
fully
go ahead.
agree with Felipe, first of all, on, on young people being the really engine for this transformation. And if I may say, my office, I think, is also one of the youngest office, well, not myself included, but yeah, it's essential. So transformation always starts with people, right? It cannot, I mean, it really, that is really the basis. And especially with brave internal change makers, and we have hundreds of you here on this call, almost 700. So, well, of course, maybe I'll just use the example of New York community that Liliana is leading. It began very small, driven by colleagues committed to smarter, more flexible ways of working, and quickly it grew into a vibrant network of over 4,000 members globally. And this can be said about all of the 5 communities that I mentioned earlier. I mean, all of them have thousands of memberships, collectively 15,000, as I just said earlier. And we are deliberately empowering these culture catalysts by encouraging them to lean in, to pilot agile teams, protecting innovation time, and interactive methods for team building. Now, I get that that many of you may not always have managers who understand, you know, these, well, the UN 2.0 yet, or slowly kind of coming to these, you know, to these issues. But these bottom-up efforts really are sparking a lot of enthusiasm, and it's improving productivity and shifting attitude towards embracing risks. And I should mention that, you know, we're really approaching this at all levels, right? And you've heard from leaders throughout this week who are committed to advancing innovation, advancing this culture. I mean, you've heard USGs, ASGs, resident coordinators all this week talking about this. And even at the head of entities level, I mean, there is an UN 2.0 action plan that all the heads of entity have committed to implementing. There's a playbook for everybody in the UN system. So it's bottom up, but it's also, right, at the top level, we are holding the leaders accountable to advancing this goal. So, and my advice to leader is to identify their internal innovators. If you're on this goal, please identify your internal innovators early on and support them by providing safe space needed to take risks and to experiment. But I would also ask to look inward and ask yourselves, are you comfortable with your team using tools and approaches that you might not fully understand? Where do you personally need to grow? It can be challenging and even daunting, but today more than ever, we as leaders must lead by an example, even when terrain feels unfamiliar. But I have to say that the managers that I interact with on a daily basis, they want this, right? I also brief all incoming resident coordinators on all kinds of issues, And the UN 2.0 is really the thing that gets all resident coordinators excited, right? And so, I think that conversations like this are really important in advancing.
Great, thank you. Ro, maybe you can pick up on that thread, which is like, what's a couple really practical pieces of advice? How do we find these people? How do we support them? Say a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks, Shauna. So, as Shauna mentioned, I'm the director of the Intersectionality Lab. And so, this builds on comments that Azonia said before and Felipe, that we believe in the lab that everyone can be a catalyst for change. And the lab just provides the resources, the systems, the tools, as an incubator for initiatives. And so, essentially, what the iLab does, and I just share this approach. We imagine seeing the world through a kaleidoscopic lens and being able to see not just the shared aspects of our layered humanity, but where our perspectives intersect to spark co-creativity and innovation. This is the focus of the lab. We do it through events, pedagogical symposia, curricular initiatives, also faculty, student, and workforce applied research models, which have been quite impactful, and building these industry partnerships and these ecosystems that are also intergenerational with faculty, students, and the workforce. And so the big question we've asked this year, and it's going to just lead into my one example here, is how does an idea spread through a system? This is what the lab has asked. And there's two approaches. One is the diffusion of innovation theory, which is how ideas spread through a population over time. We have innovators, early adopters, and so on. But on the other hand, we have something called the adjacent possible. And this comes from the field of evolutionary biology, the idea that systems evolve through incremental connections alongside other systems. And so, how we apply this across cultures is that the more ideas circulate transculturally, the more they generate innovations. And again, we're all part of this sparkline process, entrepreneurs creating new inventions, scientists discovering new worldviews, and artists. And so, what we do in the lab, and one example that, we as Ayaka said, we try to create an action framework of all the stakeholders. For us, it's faculty, students, and then the workforce partners that we have. And one example came from our partnership with UN Newark. We had Innovation Day at NYU. We invited UN Newark as our special guest. We had 250 participants, all NYU students, faculty, staff, and UN Global staff. Dr. Pollier was there. He helped facilitate portion of the event. And that portion was very significant because we had an ideathon where faculty, students, and UN staff collaborated together at different tables on initiatives for both institutions. And they came up with a very powerful ideas garden that we are still going through. And one initiative that we created that was voted up by the students and the faculty and the UN Newark team is an inclusive communications toolkit. And so what the faculty did was provide the theoretical grounding for it. The students created digital prototypes in areas like empathic communication, innovation, intercultural communication. And then UN Newark provided that collaborative insight from the workforce. And it was very impactful. We received a grant award a few weeks ago. And so now we're going to integrate AI-powered tools into this toolkit. And what it shows is that if we bridge these different partners in an ecosystem, we can really create the adjacent possible for everyone to be catalysts for change. And just, three quick tips in closing. One thing is shifting relational dynamics. So if you have a hierarchical organizational chart, trying to shift those for collaboration across functional areas. Again, encouraging risk-taking collaboration. This is what the lab does. Are there other platforms that you can use to do that? Shifting from advisory board models to task forces, that can be quite productive, especially if they're more lateral. Again, the sense is just creating the adjacent possible for those potentialities to converge and connecting perspectives. That's how we evolve the future.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for those three tips. I hope people are taking really fast notes. Malin, I want to bring you in because I think as I'm hearing everyone speak, I'm reflecting on the idea that there's this individual transformation that I actually spoke to. Also, Raul brought in the lens of these different teams and bridging worlds. But those things can only really happen and create the change we want if our teams are inclusive enough where everyone's ideas belong, are able to intersect with each other, where folks feel valued and their ideas can really be heard and implemented. So I'm curious, like what tips do you advise leaders on who are trying to create an inclusive workplace that reflects that possibility, and what should people be thinking about?
That's great. It's a great question. And I'm happy to, when I listen to everyone talking about everything that they are doing in terms of, UN initiatives, UN 2.0 initiatives. It's very aligned towards the work that we do with private sector as well, in terms of building cohesive culture. I think, the work that we do with private sector, it's the core that we believe is that inclusion is not an initiative. Inclusion, it's a leadership mindset and can be a culture multiplier. So this is kind of the core that it kind of embody all of the work that we do, trying to bring inclusion for the companies that we work with. And the way that we kick off this work is that this start with the leaders. It's going to be reinforced by meaningful peers managers. And kind of the goal is to build the awareness to challenge unconscious bias. So this is kind of the principle when we approach the client in terms of helping them to create any type of inclusion. And the approach that we use to try to be very concrete on this talk is that we use this top-down approach, because it's very hard to create any change, any culture change, any type of inclusion in any organization if the leadership does not embody
Right.
this mentality, this mindset. So it's really an exercise to help the leadership to embody this mindset and help them to create the tools, to create these resources to dissipate this across L2s, L3s, so across managers. And something that is interesting, this is mainly from all of the work that we have done, and this is data, that if you want to change the culture of a company, or if you want to start to create any type of inclusion, you don't need to change everything. You start with 25%. So thinking on your leadership, on your L1s and L2s, and choose who are the 25% of people that we are going to start the work, we are going to invest, they're going to embody all of these principles, and they are going to be the culture carriers and carry this on this top-down approach. So this is something that we do. It's hard to say that it's being successful, because nowadays everything is in progress, but it's getting some traction. It's getting some progression. We are going to the next level. Still, we are far away from what we would like to be in terms of inclusion. I need to be very, I think that 95% of the clients that we work with, they work in finance. They are investment banks, global banks, big allocators. So when you think about inclusion, there is so much work to do. There is this work to empower women in leadership. That's, a bunch of the work that we do. There is this work that we do a lot that is mainly trying to get away from this conscious bias. So you have the right leadership team working with you based on the skill sets, not based on gender, race, affinity, name, beauty. So, when you think about unconscious bias, it's, it's a lot of categories. So this is some of the concrete work that we do with the private sector.
Thank you. Appreciate those examples. And I'm gonna, I'm trying to picture in my head a toolkit as you all are talking around the things that we need. I'm hearing Raul say we need to shift the relational dynamics, and then Millie and I'm hearing you say, and that's going to require us to find a set of managers, ideally 25%, that are adopting it, that are actually modeling that behavior. So there's sort of a modeling what we want to see, so we can get more of it. And then there's a third thing we haven't talked as much about that I want to, maybe I'll start with you, Ozania, and hear your thoughts on this, which is, it feels like storytelling plays a huge role in enabling people to get on board, to shift culture, and especially storytelling through more inclusive, more accessible language. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've used storytelling in your work in Rwanda to explain a complex challenge, get people on board, and do that in a way that's not reliant on technical language or statistics alone.
Thank you, Shauna. I think the literature is clear that adult learning doesn't work well with formal lectures and technical textbooks. And our approach to capacity build in terms of doing these standard 2-day, 3-day workshops are less effective. Adult learning works best through experimentation and storytelling. So we've told lots of stories in Rwanda to bring the lessons home. One of my popular stories is about an old man with 3 children in a farming community with 17 camels. And upon his death, he called his children and said, we've lived together as one family. I like to see that spirit continue. So when I'm gone, first son, take half of my camels. Second child, a girl, take 1/3. Third child, a boy, take 2/3 of whatever is left. And they had 17 camels. Of course, the kids recognize that to divide that neatly will mean slaughtering at least 2 camels, and they're in a farming community. So they went to an old lady, wise old lady in a neighboring village, and they told her the problem that their father had given them. And she said, my children, I don't have answers for you, but if it's any help, I have an old camel, no longer productive, but still moves around. So take my old camel. So they took her camel. Now they have 18. First son takes half, he took 9. The daughter takes 1/3, she took 3. She took 6, I'm sorry. 2/3 of 3 remaining. The second son, the third child, the son, took 2 camels. They returned the camel back to the old lady. Now, the point is not in this story. The point is in the lessons from the story. Development is complex. Issues are protracted and persistent. There will be no easy solutions, but you need a mindset of experimentation, of exploration, of innovation. Be ready for change and transformation. If you can do that, you will succeed. What we managed to do in Rwanda was that in spite of the leadership changes at the level of heads of agencies, we created a critical mass of leaders, not just at the heads of agencies, but as deputies and senior program leaders who understood the vision and the journey to transformation that we want to walk in Rwanda, who understood the logic that bottom has literally fallen off ODA. So the UN's footprint has to be lighter, but more strategic, has to embed critical partnerships, particularly with private sector and financial institutions. And our role is not to be in the communities. That's the role of NGOs. Our role is to support the national stakeholders with persistent and protracted development challenges. And we can prototype some actions, but you have to build in scale in all of that. So it's a new UN, a new cooperation framework we drafted. We're very ambitious about where we want to go. And we are translating all our joint programs into investment cases. So we're focusing on drivers and investments rather than on the sectors that agencies are working. I invite all of you to try and download the cooperation framework and see where the UN country team in Rwanda is headed.
Thank you so much, Adonia. Felipe, I want to bring you into this conversation. Talk to me a little bit about how you use storytelling in your work.
Thank you, Shona. So I was also following the chat, and I saw that there's many colleagues from different parts, academia, but it's also some youth activists in the call. And everyone that is involved somehow with the youth agenda know that we have a very common challenge, how to convey the urgency of youth inclusion in decision making, because in theory, we all would agree that it's very important to include young people, but then it's a practical part, it's when we go into funding, it's when we go into concrete decisions, it's when we bring a young person into a decision-making structure where we are facing these challenges, So we have this opportunity through young people really to activate this, So storytelling, then it's a crucial tool for it because, it's not really about, a structure, an institutional office, Let's think about our office in the UN system, It's not about our structure, It's really about the mandate that this office represents in terms of youth across the world, Young people that when we consider those under 30 represent 50% of the world's population, half of the world's population, So it's not really about us. It's not really about me. It's about the young people that are represented in the mandate of our office. So in terms of practical tools, how we can showcase that, how we can showcase that we need this cultural transformation, how we can showcase that young people are already change makers, that they are doing their part, It's about us institutions to bring them, and it's about the UN as an organization that brings together governments across the world, So it's about the UN as that global platform, In this case, some years back, and this was not something we launched recently, the former envoy, before the office was established, before we have this mandate given by the General Assembly that is that in terms of institutionality, it was a big step in terms of recognizing the role of young people in decision making and the role of young people as change makers. The envoys decided to launch an initiative to showcase the agency of young people through storytelling. So every 2 years, there's an open application, and we try to find young leaders across the world coming from different backgrounds that really showcase that young people are already change-making things, and it's about us to include young people, so it's not really about, the direct impact of this initiative in those 17 young people that are, selected, but it's really about their stories to showcase the agency of youth inclusion and youth leadership, and I want to share one of those stories, which is the story of V. Kativu, who is a young leader from Zimbabwe, a young woman leader from Zimbabwe, and V is part of the current cohort of young leaders of the Sustainable Development Goals, and she's a first-generation university student in her family from Zimbabwe, and she turned her personal journey into a global movement for education empowerment. And she launched an initiative, it's called Empowered by V, and I invite everyone to Google it and to know more about V, because she's such a powerful change maker herself. And her story brings SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 5, about gender equality, to life, and it's very easy to understand what are we talking about when we're talking about the SDGs when we go into this story and we hear from V, so I think that's a concrete example of what we're doing this, and I have plenty of other stories to share, but unfortunately we don't have enough time.
Thank you, Felipe. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you grounding it in a individual story, because I think at the scale we're talking about, it's easy to lose sight of individuals. I have two more questions I want to ask, and I also was going to try and shift us to Q&A, but I realized that a bunch of the questions in the Q&A map to my remaining questions. So I'll try and combine them a little bit and see if we can do two things at once. So the first one is really around measurement. There are a bunch of questions in the chat around this, and I'm curious about it too. Maybe, Milena, I'll ask you more broadly, and then Ozonia more specifically in your context. How do we measure whether the workplace is actually becoming more inclusive or we're actually making progress? What's like a tool or approach, an indicator, something you measure? And we're going to try and keep it super brief so we can get to the questions in the chat to help us understand if we're on the right track.
Yeah, the data. How do you get the data? There is, some progression is happening. So, we are like a leadership assessment and coaching company, and we work with the private sector. So we need to be process oriented. This is the way that we build all of the process, the approach when we start any work with any organization. So along the process that we have feedback forms, we have 360. We have assessments, so assessments to make sure when there is a hiring process, they are hiring people based on skill sets and not just about intuition. Of course, intuition is a component. There needs to be the chemistry fit, that's fine. But there is to be this, what are the skill sets, the hard data. We have a process along, for all of this work that we do with inclusion, woman leadership. So there is a bunch of work towards, through forms, feedback forms, 360, and we make sure to capture the data and to show that there is some progression is happening towards the data. Even that is 10% of progression, it's 10%, it's not zero. So there is some advancement on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You have a really comprehensive approach. I'm also something that strikes me is also that, like, for each individual on this call, there are probably things we can imagine, like what would we start to see if we were on the right track, and bringing that into everyone's daily reflection, I think, is another interesting approach. Ozonia, why don't you talk about a little bit about that? Like, how are you measuring in the day-to-day of whether things are sort of going in the right direction?
Many platforms. First of all, you have the UN Staff Association, which is often the filter for staff views and perceptions, particularly in contexts where the staff feel not capable of speaking to their leadership because of internal context in the particular organization. So the regular dialogue with the Staff Association is important, and they attend country team retreats. We have dialogues with governments, because sometimes government feel that you are kicking out national staff and hiring international staff members. So that's an important filter of how they perceive how inclusive the UN system is. But also, I was amazed to find 3 different perception surveys of UN staff when I arrived in Rwanda in 2022. And each of the surveys kept saying the same things, but I didn't find a plan of action. So actually, your baseline is the perception surveys, because on the basis of the perception survey, you have to develop a plan of action as leadership and negotiate that plan of action with the staff association, but also with the UN staff themselves. So every other month, bi-monthly, we have all staff meetings. Not all issues get mentioned there because there's asymmetry of power. So many staff will not want to mention issues, but you're encouraging them to channel it through the staff association. What is often missing in UN processes is action. We do the analytics, we gather the data, it's not followed up of action. So when you have a plan of action where you check in and measure at the level of leadership, but also at the level of the operational leadership. Operational leadership in terms of the day-to-day programming is our deputies. They are the ones in the front line of engagement with staff and national counterparts. But also you have those that work specifically on issues like procurement, human resources, the core operation of the system. How do you hold the leadership to account? What is the leadership compact with them and myself and my colleagues in the country team? What is the leadership compact with our deputies in terms of how they lead the teams to create inclusive, cohesive UN teams? You know, my favorite word is that we spend more time at the offices than we spend with our families. Check it, Shona. You arrive at work before 9 a.m. Most colleagues leave at 5 or 6 p.m., sometimes later. By the time you get home, you're busy tucking the kids to bed, sometimes making dinner or with your lover or your spouse. And then by 11 p.m., you're on your bed. So 8 to 9 hours of your most productive time is spent in the office. That office had better be conducive to make staff willing, looking forward each time they get out of bed. They have to be looking forward to coming there. So for me, it's personal, but it's also strategic in terms of my leadership and the accountability I hold my colleague heads of agencies to in terms of how we make the UN office a welcoming place for our staff members on a consistent basis. So we have the data. It's action that is missing, including on the gender assessments, on inclusion of women. There are many, leadership positions for women. If you don't hold yourself to account, it's never going to get done.
Thank you for that. I appreciate where you left us, which is like, how do we help all these individual people who are giving so much of themselves to this work come up, show up, and really be able to contribute fully and feel the weight of that? And that's maybe where I'll ask one more question. I would say generational divides have come up a number of times in the answers folks have given. I'm seeing little bits of questions in the chat about young folks, about how folks who might not identify as young folks can operate intergenerationally. And so maybe Felipe, I'll ask you to answer really quickly. Like, what are the specific skills that you see younger team members really bringing to the UN workforce? And maybe just give us like a couple skills, not a lot of explanation. Because then I want to also ask Raul, like, how can organizations also not, including and beyond young folks, make sure that all those team members are able to bridge a widening generational gap? So let's first like zoom in to youth, since that's come up a lot in the questions, and then let's zoom out together and sort of talk about like how that plays intergenerationally. So Felipe, you want to give us a couple examples of skills?
Yes, thank you, Shauna, for this important question. And allow me to build from what I said at my first intervention.
Great.
I think we cannot look at this topic of youth inclusion, youth participation, youth engagement without an intergenerational lens and component, and that's a real clue of this cultural shift and transformation. And that's the only transformation that will be sustainable, So on this line, how we really accelerate and advance on this idea of intergenerational leadership, we've been working not only like looking into inside the UN, but also we've been looking outside, how private sector is doing this, and we launched very recently an interesting report facing the idea of intergenerational leadership in the private sector and how this unlocks innovation, and how this has a positive impact in the 3 dimension of people, profit, and the planet, And I invite everyone to go deeper into this report. We did it with St. Gallen Symposium, which is a university based in Switzerland, and also with the Club of Rome with it, a think tank bringing together different voices from different countries of the world on also on public policies. And one of the findings of that, report is really that when companies activate this notion of intergenerational leadership, there's a positive impact in many dimensions, which includes strategizing on longer term timescales, overcoming the success trap that is sometimes described. And it's also about creating a very important friction, a positive friction when it's about problem solving and strengthening accountability on leadership, So I think this is a crucial part. I invite everyone to go deeper. I know we don't have many time, because also the report puts concrete actions that we can bring into institutions. I mentioned that some of them is something we are doing inside our office, like having a youth advisory board, recognizing also that, having that as an accountability system. But of course, it's much more than that. It's about a cultural transformation. It's about understanding that every generation has something to bring. But of course, it's impossible to advance in this without psychological safety. But I'm sure Raul and Milena can talk more about that.
Well, and I just want to note, Felipe, that as you were speaking, it looks like someone put the report link in the chat. So hopefully folks can take advantage of that. Raul, maybe I'll end with you and would love to hear how can we leverage the contributions of all of the people in our organizations across generations to make the change we're seeking?
Thank you, Shauna, and thank you, Felipe. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit from Felipe's comments and fully concur with all of those. We live in a multi-generational workforce, and so engaging that workforce is the key to the future of work. And so we can do this by creating inclusive environments, fostering open communication, promoting intergenerational collaboration, and we can see when that happens, that unique combination of knowledge and skills can really spark innovative solutions, like I mentioned earlier with the toolkit. So thinking intergenerationally, I just want to put this out there in terms of how do we evolve our definition of creativity. So in the 80s, it used to be that creativity was focused on the individual and how their work intersected with a field or the system at large. But now in the field of global, in the era of globalization and emerging technology, we are working across cultures, we're working collaborative 5 transformative solutions together. And so this is called participatory creativity. And this is something that we focus on when we think about multi-generational collaboration. And it comes down to 2 questions. Instead of thinking, what do you want to create? We ask, what movement do you want to be a part of? And we find that when students hear that question, they feel that it's much more accessible to them to be part of this concept of creativity, and also for seasoned professionals as well who may think that, oh, our time has passed. No, we can collaborate to arrive at solutions that build on world movements and organizational change. So, this is a very important concept for thinking about, multi-generational projects, other aspects. You can do reciprocal learning ecosystems where there's a learning exchange between the mentor and the mentee in areas like technology. As we know, one skill that younger professionals bring is that fluency in digital collaboration and evolving tech. And then how can we help them still retain human agency, right? And this is important so that we're not seeing the technologies replacing our skill set, it extends it. And the last thing that I'll share, because I know we're pressed for time, is that the younger generation does share, they have their individual traditional identities, but they also are born with awareness of a global identity, right? Through technology, through access to media ecosystems and so on. But we, across generations, can turn that into global citizenship, right? We can turn that into global responsibility. And so I think, again, linking those interests intergenerationally and building an ecosystem of partners between higher education, different institutions around the world, and also, of course, intergenerationally. That's the key to UN 2.0 is this concept of collaborative innovation across these different stakeholders.
Awesome. Thank you so much. What a beautiful place to end our discussion. I want to thank all of our speakers and everyone who asked great questions that we were able to incorporate throughout. I'm walking away thinking about how we're going to charge our leaders with modeling the cultures we want to see, the responsibility that you reminded us of, Ozonia, to create the workplaces that live up to the amount of time we're asking people to spend in them, thinking about how to leverage those in the generations after me and before me in my institution, and how to shift some of those relational dynamics so that we can create a better whole. So thank you, everyone, for the insights that you've all shared. And I will pass it on to Talea von Lupin, who is going to share one last thing with us before we leave you to go on the rest of your day.
Thank you, Shauna, and a huge thanks for this fantastic panel, for all of your insights and inspiring the UN system and all of our partners for systems change. And as we wrap up this last opening panel of the week, I need to say that we couldn't be more excited about this second UN 2.0 week, because honestly, at first, we almost felt a little bit uncertain on whether UN 2.0 could really make a difference during a time when the UN faces such a heavy pressure to transform. But I think this week for me and most of us has very clearly shown that being more data-driven, more digital, more innovative, and looking at our culture and transformation isn't just important, but it might be the essential piece to getting this transformation right. And of course, we are super excited to see all of your enthusiasm, with over 20,000 participants joining in over the course of this week, and more than 100 amazing speakers sharing insights and perspectives. Thank you to all of you. So what's next after today? We still have an expo session coming up this later today, in an hour from now. But after that, Ayaka has mentioned already, firstly, we have an action plan on UN 2.0, where every single UN entity has committed to embedding UN 2.0 even deeper to the ways how we are working and moving forward this important topic. Second, let's stay connected. Let's stay connected through these communities of practice that you see flashed up here. Scan the QR code and make sure that we are continuing this conversation and move from talking about ways to change into joint projects and into action. And finally, if you're already innovating in ways that does have real impact and where you feel it has the possibility to scale, we will be launching a UN system-wide UN 2.0 awards. So please do watch out for details coming soon, and we can't wait to hear from you and to go onto this transformation journey together. But for now, thank you, everyone, and happy UN 2.0 Friday.